Way back in the old days of 1990-something, a bunch of dudes sat around and looked at Doom and said, but what if it was even more controversial? And Duke Nukem 3D was born.
Damn, I'm looking good.
But then you might not know that a few years later, still 1990-something, a bunch of dudes, this time in Brazil, sat around and looked at Duke Nukem 3D and said, but what if it was worse? And Duke Nukem 3D on the Sega Genesis was born.
It's time to kick ass and chew bubble gum, and I'm all out of gum.
Yes, Duke Nukem 3D had an officially licensed port on the Sega Genesis. But the story behind this bizarre game is more interesting than you might think. Well, at least I thought it was pretty interesting. So, as you may or may not know, the original Duke Nukem came out for MS-DOS in 1991, and it was actually a platformer. A sequel came out in 1993, also on DOS, and it was pretty similar to the first game. And these games did decent for themselves, but the series really exploded in popularity with its jump to 3D in Duke Nukem 3D in 1996. And since the PC version was doing so well, 3D Realms decided to start putting it onto every console possible. So in 1997, it got ported to Mac computers, the Sega Saturn, the PlayStation, the Nintendo 64, and even the Game.com. Because why not, I guess.
Damn, that's the second.
And with this being a port of a PC FPS game on consoles in the mid-90s, the quality of the ports definitely varies quite a bit. But the strangest port, besides the Game.com, came out a year later in 1998, and it was, of course, the Sega Genesis version. But the Genesis at this point was already almost 10 years old, so you might be wondering, how and why did such an advanced game get put back onto such an old system? The answer is Brazil. Why Brazil, you might be asking? Well, if you've been around on my channel for a while, you might remember when I talked about a lot of old bootleg games from China, because back in the 80s and 90s, companies just didn't sell their games there because of the ridiculous import fees. Or if they did ship them there, they were super expensive, so most people just weren't able to afford them. And basically the same thing happened in Brazil. It just wasn't worth shipping games there because it was so expensive to import them that no one could afford them. But games did end up getting legally sold there, just in stranger ways, which is how we got stuff like Duke Nukem 3D for the Genesis. So the first big game company to legally start selling their stuff in Brazil at an affordable price was Sega. They did this through a partnership with the Brazilian company TecToy. Basically, Sega gave TecToy the rights and resources to manufacture and distribute the Master System and its games in Brazil, and they would split the profits somehow. And with no official NES around yet, Sega's Master System actually did shockingly well and still continues to sell there to this day, although at this point they're mainly sold as plug-and-play systems. So Brazil was the only place in the world where the Master System actually beat the NES. But with the success of the Master System, Sega decided to bring in the Genesis, or the Mega Drive if you're from anywhere outside North America, including Brazil, and the Game Gear. Although official sales numbers from Brazil don't seem to get released too often, it does seem like the Mega Drive still sold very well in Brazil. But it just could never beat the Master System for some reason. In Brazil, it seems like gamers are happy to keep their older consoles longer, which is still a trend there today, as consoles like the PS2 and Xbox 360 still seem to be more popular than their newer models. And just looking at TecToy's website, you can see that they pretty much only sell older games now. They have 3 consoles on the market right now: the Atari Flashback, the previously mentioned Master System, and this TecToy Legends Core, which appears to have a bunch of old arcade games mixed in with a bunch of random Mega Drive and Super NES games. So when video games started making the jump to 3D in the mid-90s, Brazil just didn't really seem to care. They were perfectly content with their Master Systems and Mega Drives, but the Sega Saturn showed up anyway. Just like in the rest of the world, it flopped. TecToy started losing money around 1997 due to what they claimed was simply a loss of interest in new games. They started making ports of more interesting games on their older consoles to try to attract new customers and the people who already own those consoles. And this wasn't really that new of a thing for them, as they had been porting different games to the Master System since the late 80s. But it was around this time that they really started going all in with these ports. TecToy made Brazil-exclusive Master System ports for Earthworm Jim, Sonic Blast, Virtua Fighter, Street Fighter II, and even Mortal Kombat 3. The quality of these games is definitely questionable, but hey, I mean, it's still pretty cool to see them running on a Master System. So what big games made it to the Mega Drive then? Well, it got a game called Nightmare Circus, which according to SegaRetro.com is one of the worst games ever released, and a bunch of compilations of games that had been out for years, and Duke Nukem 3D. And then they just kind of gave up. Now that is what I call an all-star lineup. So right now you might be thinking, how is Duke Nukem 3D on the Genesis? Is it actually good? And well, it exists. You can play it. Would you ever really want to play it? Probably not. The game is really more like Wolfenstein with a Duke Nukem texture pack than the actual Duke Nukem 3D. It doesn't look or play terribly, but that being said, it doesn't really look or play great or even good either. Now I will clarify, I am playing this on an emulator, so some of the issues I had could come from emulation, but from what I've heard, the physical release pretty much had the same exact problems. The first thing that I noticed was how liney, if that's a word, everything looked, especially the enemies. The emulator I was using actually has a bunch of different visual filters though, so I put on some old school TV filters to blur the lines a bit, and I actually thought it might look better like this. This was probably more in line with how it would have looked on a TV back in the 90s, so I just kept it like this for the rest of my time playing, which was not long. You will quickly notice that this game is hard, frustratingly hard. I even switched to easy mode at some point, but even then I literally could not get through the first level. Now I might just be bad, that's probably part of it, but I felt like the main factor in this difficulty, at least for me, was the controls. They are not good. Now I grew up playing N64 shooters like GoldenEye and Turok, so I'm no stranger to awkward early console FPS controls, but this just felt especially awful to me. I mean, this controller was not made for first-person shooters, so I didn't really expect the controls to be good, but I feel like TecToy could have made the game a little bit easier with just how bad it controls. Moving and looking around feels super clunky, which I feel like resulted in most of my deaths. Without the ability to strafe or even look around more quickly, turning corners and opening doors is super dangerous and enemies are almost guaranteed to hit you. Just aiming in general is difficult. Even when I was just trying to hit this exploding barrel here, which is just sitting still, I struggled to aim directly at it and hit it. Some kind of crosshair or something would have been nice. Also, I felt like I ran out of ammo really quick because of the amount of shots I missed, and this game is not generous with ammo. I mean, what is this, an enemy for ants? How am I supposed to hit this guy when he has like 6 pixels? I would try just running around and kicking guys, but that is not really a good strategy here because these guys just never miss. Even the world's smallest enemy back there lands almost every single shot on me because getting out of the way is not easy with these controls. Also, every time I died, which is pretty often, the frame rate totally tanks and the game experiences some ridiculous slowdown, which just makes dying even more frustrating because you have to wait like a whole minute sometimes before you restart. Again though, this could be an emulation issue, but I've heard of bad slowdowns with the physical versions too, so I don't really think it is. Also, I just felt like I should mention the music in this game. It's not great, but it's really not that bad either. A lot of people really like to complain about the music in this game, but I really think that's like the least of its problems. So after dying quite a few times, many of which were to this guy on the other side of the door, who I did not realize was just blowing up, I decided to look up the long play for this game, because I just did not feel like playing anymore. And Jesus, the first level is over 20 minutes long. I would have spontaneously combusted if I kept playing this. As you can see, the game is pretty repetitive. There's a little bit of variety between levels, like different enemies, walls, floors, and occasionally graffiti or other artwork on the walls, but that's about it for the most part. Oh, and Luke Skywalker is in the final level, so that's cool, I guess. There are a total of 9 levels in the game, very loosely based on the second episode of Duke 3D, Lunar Apocalypse. The main similarities are that the level names are mostly the same or very similar, and they both use the same final boss, the Overlord, which is pretty cool. The port includes most of the weapons from the original game and a few items too. The coolest of these items is the spacesuit, which actually got scrapped in the original PC version but made it into this one, for some reason. So really, this game, despite all its flaws, is cool just to see running on the Genesis. It's kinda like that Half-Life Dreamcast port I talked about, where sure, it's a cool novelty and a great topic to bring up at parties, but it's really just not that great to actually play. I'd say that debatably though, its biggest issue is the fact that in this port, Duke just kind of becomes some generic blank slate type character, more like the original Doom guy or Gordon Freeman, where in the original Duke 3D, he stood out as such an interesting character for the time because he actually had a personality. He was a ridiculous over-the-top action hero parody where Doom guy was just some silent one-man army, and here Duke feels more like that silent one-man army, but without the army. He's just some guy. The only times you hear him talk are when he says the game's difficulty levels,
Yeah, piece of cake.
or when he says,
Let's rock.
between levels. It would have been nice even just to hear a couple one-liners between levels, or even just some text on the screen that says something kind of funny, but we didn't really get any of that. And sure, there was some story at the end of the game, but come on, who actually played long enough to get to that? Well, that was weird. But we're not finished yet, because the rest of the story of this game is just as weird. So as I said earlier, there was a more accurate Sega Saturn port of the original Duke Nukem 3D. In Brazil, TecToy did release this port, actually before the Mega Drive version in 1997. But they had nothing to do with developing the Saturn port or anything, they just released it and should have been done with it. But it was after this Saturn port came out that they decided they wanted to make a Mega Drive port. But here's where stuff gets weird. So the rights to Duke Nukem have been an issue for a while, and a lot of different companies have been involved with the series and sort of have claims on it. But at the point in time when TecToy was developing their port, 3D Realms developed and owned the series. But a company called GT Interactive was publishing some Duke Nukem stuff. When TecToy was developing their port, they never went to 3D Realms to ask for permission. In 1998, they allegedly went to GT Interactive instead, who sold them the license for the game. So 3D Realms claimed that the game was unlicensed, while TecToy continued to claim that they had obtained a license through GT. The problem with that was that nobody could ask GT Interactive because they went out of business a year after the game came out. GT then got bought by Infogrames, then just kind of got absorbed into them. Then Infogrames went out of business. And then for some mind-boggling reason, they came back from the dead and renamed themselves Atari. What? Then Atari went bankrupt but is now back and is working with the two other companies also called Atari to make a casino. So yeah, GT Interactive is long gone. But it still gets weirder. 3D Realms still exists now, somehow, but they're just a shell of their former selves and they should probably just go away. But back in 2010, right before the absolute disaster of a game that was Duke Nukem Forever, 3D Realms sold the Duke Nukem rights to Gearbox Software. Gearbox bought everything involving the Duke Nukem IP, which would have included the Mega Drive port. So in the public documents from this transaction, there's no mention of this port. But on page 50, there is a Sega Master System port from 1997 listed. The problem with that is that it just doesn't exist. There is no Master System version of this game. There was, however, the Saturn port in 1997 and the Mega Drive or Genesis port in 1998. So, what does this mean? I have absolutely no clue. The Duke Nukem Wiki, obviously the most reliable news source, suggests that this was probably referring to the Sega Saturn port. They believe that this was most likely a mistake on 3D Realms' part, as they meant to put Saturn but just put Master System by accident on the document, and GT Interactive took that as just Sega consoles in general. So that was probably why they just went ahead and sold the license to TecToy without 3D Realms' permission, because they believed that they had the rights to the game for Sega consoles instead of just the Saturn. So yeah, I guess that makes sense. But that's still not the end of it. In 2015, a company that sells reproduction retro games and consoles called Pico Interactive bought the rights to Duke Nukem 3D for the Genesis only from TecToy. So once again, they just didn't go to the actual owner of Duke Nukem, who is now Gearbox, they just went right to TecToy. And the legality of TecToy's port was already pretty questionable, so really that just gets even weirder. But Pico started selling the game in cartridge form worldwide on their website that same year, and no one tried to stop them. They started producing and selling the game with no interference at all from Gearbox. But right around that same time, 3D Realms just decided to make a new Duke Nukem game, even though they sold the license just like 4 years earlier. Oh, and once again, they just didn't get permission from Gearbox. I don't know why this is a trend here. So, Gearbox sued the shit out of them. After a while, the lawsuit ended and 3D Realms lost, obviously, with Gearbox saying that they are the only company that owns the Duke Nukem rights. So what happened with Pico Interactive then? Well, they just kept selling the game. They sold the game for 5 more years on their site until it just disappeared in 2020. You can still access the listing though if you have a direct link, but it just says sold out. So it's unclear whether Gearbox stepped in or whether Pico just discontinued the game, as they have been known to do with other games. You can still buy this new version on eBay or a more questionable looking homebrew version for pretty cheap, like 10 to 20 bucks for the loose cart. And honestly, I might buy it someday, and if you're a big Duke Nukem fan and you want to dust off the old Sega Genesis, it could be an interesting little game to pick up. Just be prepared for death and disappointment.